The Super Nintendo is widely considered to be one of the best video game consoles of all time, and its legendary library is celebrated by retro enthusiasts of all ages, but this golden guide of the 16-bit era has some serious stains on its impeccable reputation, and we're going to take a closer look at a few of them as Innocent Until Proven Guilty presents the worst Super Nintendo games ever made. The infamous Pit Fighter was produced in a collaboration between Tengen and THQ and released for the SNES in 1992. This Atari arcade port blazed the trail for Mortal Kombat by employing digitized actors to fill the roles of the main three characters: Buzz the professional wrestler, Tai the kickboxing champion, and Kato the third-degree black belt. These fierce warriors have unique stats that are reflective of their real-world counterparts, and their signature skill sets can be tapped into through a very simple button-mashing heavy control scheme. A and B punch and kick respectively, while X jumps and Y blocks. The standard attacks are quite weak, and I got my ass handed to me repeatedly by the imbalanced NPC until I've discovered the secret weapon of mass destruction that I've affectionately nicknamed the Mat Maneuver. The Mat Maneuver is performed by pressing A while holding up, and it lifts the aforementioned brutal bastards off their feet and slams them to the floor in one swift motion that decimates their large life bars in seconds flat. Once victory is attained, Buzz and his allies are hilariously elevated to the next level and showered of adulation and bonus points before a new challenger enters the fray. Minus the interstitial grudge matches that occasionally deviate from the norm, the overall gameplay is very formulaic and repetitive, with a presentation plagued by bland visuals and a boring soundtrack, but the biggest sin against SNES Pit Fighter comes in the fact that it's nearly impossible to beat due to terrible programming. The rambunctious rivals will tear into us with reckless abandon, leaving very little space to develop a proper defense strategy, and when we manage to survive the unrelenting onslaught, our battered health bar remains as a constant reminder of the powerful pummeling we just endured. It seems to me that this collaborative crew forgot that the Super Nintendo didn't function on the same quarter pumping system as the cabinet, and we're left with an unfair and poorly translated adaptation that's a disgusting insult to the stellar Street Fighter II port that followed a mere few months later, which is why I ruled that the verdict is guilty. Tengen and THQ dropped the ball so hard that any previous ball dropping seemed trivial in comparison, and this apparently failed so spectacularly that a whole new studio was brought in to work on the supposedly superior Sega version. Yes, you heard me right, this is one example where the old ad slogan is true: Genesis does what Nintendo don't. But it's kind of a moot point now, since you can check out the original at a cheaper price along with a bunch of other cool games on the Midway Arcade Treasures 2 collection for the Xbox and PS2. As for this abomination, the time has come for me to put it out of its misery. Released near the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, Rise of the Robots is a port of the PC fighter from Mirage and the notorious publisher Acclaim that begins on a very promising note. The cyborg protagonist strikes a wicked pose as the title appears on the screen, accompanied by a rocking little ditty called The Dark, composed by guitar virtuoso extraordinaire Brian May. Yes, Rise of the Robots features a couple songs from the Queen Axeman himself. I have absolutely no idea how they were able to accomplish that, but I'll give them props for bringing such a musical talent into the mix. The Brian May intro transitions into the options menu where variables from the round timer to the difficulty are set as one or two players square off in a series of robotic ruckuses. Regardless of which mode is selected, the first player is placed in the shoes of the aforementioned Blue Basher as he works to neutralize the threat of the evil supervisor and her maverick machines. Our mission is to take down each of these metallic monsters in the traditional best-of-3 round style that defined the genre, but Rise of the Robots' interpretation of this tried-and-true format is very one-dimensional. In sticking with the Street Fighter precedent, the L and R buttons produce the strongest attacks while the mids were mapped to X and Y and the lights are A and B. I generally relied on a combination of the strong attacks and the strategic block to deliver the finishing blow, and I was rewarded with a short cinematic revealing the gruesome fate of the vile villains upon their defeat. From here on out, the cycle repeats anew with a fresh foe to face, and the road to the supervisor becomes ever more bumpier since the AI programming shares a lot in common with SNES Pit Fighter, and there are no continues to rely on if we fail in our quest. Luckily, Rise of the Robots differs from that putrid port in that there is a difficulty setting, so I felt no shame in toggling down to easy and mashing my way to the finish line. The ensuing ending that's triggered by the supervisor's demise is a lackluster collage of the previous cutscenes lazily strung together, bringing a close to a third-rate fighter whose detractors far surpass its fans. Rise of the Robots is a very interesting concept, and its enhanced presentation adds a lot to the overall appeal, so it's a shame that the gameplay itself is so lacking. The controls are stiff, the combat is clunky, and the replay value is non-existent. If graphics and music alone could make a game, then Rise of the Robots would be a solid contender, but that's sadly not the case, and they ultimately serve only as pretty window dressing on a subpar experience, which is why I ruled that the verdict is guilty! Acclaim has a history of hit-and-miss titles during the 16-bit era, and this is one of their biggest misses. Rise of the Robots is a mess. A visually pleasing mess for sure, but a mess nonetheless. I can't vouch for the PC original since I've never played it, but this SNES port is nearly as bad as Pit Fighter, and it has to pay for its egregious crimes. As a fan of Queen and Brian May, this gives me no pleasure, but I'm left with no choice. Rise of the Robots, your time is up! There were a number of edutational titles on the Super Nintendo, but none is more bizarre than Captain Novolin. This 1992 sculptured software production from Raya Systems involves the titular hero and his adventures in dealing with his diabetes, and we're instructed to implement a physician-prescribed code upon firing up the cartridge. As I'm neither a diabetic nor in contact with a doctor about diabetes, I stuck with the default set of zeros and proceeded to the plot. We begin with the captain getting a workout in on a treadmill before being interrupted by an urgent news report informing him that the mayor has been kidnapped by a band of invading aliens. These aliens have taken the form of assorted junk foods and transported the mayor, who also happens to be diabetic, to Mount Way Up Thar. What follows is a seemingly endless stream of diabetes-related lectures, tests, insulin shots, and routine blood glucose meter checkups. The blood glucose meter is the most vital mechanic for ensuring the captain's healthy lifestyle, and we need to keep it as close to the middle as possible by eating healthy foods. A doctor lends assistance as to the types of foods to consume before each level, and we subsequently see these particular items out in the vast terrain trodden by the diabetic do-gooder. Upon taking to the streets, a timestamp and interface will appear at the top of the screen detailing important information, including a pictorial tally of the current meal's contents. These constituted calories have a significant impact on the blood glucose meter, with exaggerated portions raising the BG strip into the red and meager meal sizes dropping it down to the blue, so it's best to maintain a balanced diet over the course of the journey or else suffer the loss of the limited lives as the malnourished protagonist passes out. This temperamental condition ensures that the mayoral rescue mission is a Herculean feat, and it's exacerbated by the bouncing donuts, bubble-blowing gum wads, and other sweetened snacks that grind our forward momentum to a screeching halt. Owing to the obvious comic book influences, I expected to be able to lay a vicious smackdown on these literal candy asses with flying fists of fury and laser beams, but the controls disappointingly indicated that my only defense option was to jump over them by pressing A. It soon became abundantly clear why the GameFAQs community unanimously decreed this to be unforgiving, and I had a hell of a time trying to avoid being OD'd into a sugar coma, but I later discovered that there actually is a method for eliminating these cavity creeps, albeit a very awkward and unconventional one. In true side-scrolling fashion, the captain can stomp his enemies into dust, but this attack is not implemented automatically a la Mario and Sonic. Instead, we have to press down on the D-pad at the right moment or else face the horrible consequences. Unnecessarily convoluted execution aside, the stomp greatly reduced the difficulty and I was finally able to progress further into this SNES oddity. The route towards Mount Way Up There travels through the forest and over the sea, involving interactions with various authority figures such as Ranger Ralph, diabetic quizzes that translate into extra points in health, and a climactic battle with the big bad Blubberman. Blubberman flings pies and is protected by a machine that sends harmful electrical currents in our direction. Simply leap over the pies and toggle the switch 3 times to disintegrate the slimy scourge and free the incapacitated mayor. Thus concludes one of the weirdest games I've ever played and the epitome of niche marketing. Most kids in the early 90s were looking to ride the blast processing wave or taste that Mode 7 goodness, not learn how to cope with diabetes, so it's no surprise at all that Raya Systems folded before the Super Nintendo was off store shelves. With that said though, there's surely some value in this for the target demographic, and Sculpture Software did as good of a job as anyone could in the field of edutainment. The controls are admittedly way too simplistic, and I would have preferred to have a secondary means of attack, but the presentation is leaps and bounds beyond its peers, the frame rate is smooth, and the stage and enemy design is creative. Captain Novolin may be lacking in many departments, but it has a certain charm to it that I'm attracted to, and it's successful enough in what it set out to achieve, which is why I rule that the verdict is innocent. I'm sure a number of you are questioning my sanity, but I'm sticking to my guns and acquitting this odious offender on the same grounds that I used to save Crystal's ponytail, meaning that it's salvageable when taken into context with the other entries in the edutainment genre. That of course doesn't mean it's worth seeking out, and I myself don't even own a physical copy due to the high prices, so just do what I did and download the ROM to play on an EverDrive or whatever emulator you prefer. Raya went out of business decades ago, so it's a completely victimless crime to experience one of the wackiest novelties committed to a plastic cartridge. Bebe's Kids is a 1994 beat-em-up by Radical Entertainment and Motown Games based on the 1992 animated movie of the same name. In it, we play as either LeSean or Khalil, 2 pint-sized mischief makers who are set loose on an unsuspecting theme park and immediately besieged by the workers and security guards. Our goal is to rough up these responsible adults, and the control for executing these evil deeds are very straightforward, with the Y and X buttons delivering a barrage of punches and kicks. The punches and kicks are stiff and laggy overall, and they're about as powerful as a peck on the cheek, but pressing Y while holding L unleashes a devastating uppercut, and this is supplemented by a variety of ranged weapons which can be utilized by holding L and pressing B. The titular troublemakers have a number of tricks up their sleeves to disturb the peace, but limited lives and no continues to fulfill their true potential, so the only way to ensure any kind of success in this brutal brawler is to spam those buttons like you've never done before. After emptying the park entrance, the scene shifts to a gift shop where the baby of the family drops glassware of all shapes and sizes. The children's guardian races across the floor to save as many of the fragile pieces as possible, and we're supposed to prevent him from doing so by breaking them on their downward descent. This is much easier said than done, but I figured out that the quickest way to complete the task is to jump kick the glass after guiding him away, then lather, rinse, and repeat until you've reached the haunted house. The haunted house offers a maze of corridors that's a refreshing change of pace on initial inspection, but it soon becomes a burden to anyone who dares to delve into this despised licensed tie-in. I'll just cut to the chase and say that you're gonna get lost. It's inevitable, so save yourself the frustration that I felt and watch this video by Anatoray Lizard. It's absolutely necessary to get past this point, and I can't thank him enough for bailing me out of that accursed hell, so I'll put a link in the cards and description for his essential tutorial. Anyway, the haunted house leads to the pirate ship where the intensity begins to crank up a few notches, and this is thankfully followed by the conclusion. The conclusion takes place in a toxic waste pit, and it's surrounded by a sea of savage enemies and obstacles. Try as I might, I couldn't overcome this humongous hurdle, so I turned to Bebe's Kid's debug code out of sheer desperation and was greeted by a number of fascinating features. Holding select and pressing up advances the head one area, while holding select and pressing left casts a vanishing spell, but the most amusing addition is the aesthetic alterations on the title screen. With the debug code in check, I was able to make it to the final boss, and I quickly found out that he's pretty much impossible. This metallic menace has a very narrow hitbox, and I frequently found myself at the mercy of its brutal beatdowns, so I decided to use the debug to zap him out of existence. Unfortunately, this locked me in a limbo state that kept me from seeing the actual ending, but I was somehow able to advance ahead one last time, and the results, well, they speak for themselves. Wow, I'm at a loss for words. As a beat-em-up fanatic and someone who enjoyed the movie growing up, Bebe's Kid should be right up my alley, but I can't help but be turned off by the massive flaws. I already addressed the control issues, but the frame rate is an even bigger offender. The characters chug along at the speed of a slug and jump as if they're trapped on the moon, and that, combined with the excessive difficulty, made me want to tear my already receding hair out. However, as bad as that may seem, Bebe's Kids is no Dark Castle, and there are a few redeemable traits. The graphics accurately capture the art style of the movie with a nice saturated color palette that's pleasing to the eye, and the music is funktastic to say the least. I appreciate the fact that this flips the traditional beat-em-up formula on its head by placing the player in an arguably antagonistic role, but that's not enough to save this early radical entertainment project from being a dreadful failure, which is why I rule that the verdict is guilty. I've gotten many requests for this SNES movie adaptation since starting IUPG, and I can now see why. This is without a doubt the worst beat-em-up I've ever played, and it blows my mind that the devs would later go on to work on some of the Crash Bandicoot titles. I guess this is proof that even the guiltiest parties are deserving of a second chance, and Radical Entertainment has clearly atoned for all of their past transgressions, so all that remains to be done is erase their bash brainchild from these illustrious halls and proceed with the next case. Crazy Boss from the worst Sega IUPG is a colossal mind then Hong Kong 97 is a soul-shattering acid trip. This pixelated enigma from Happysoft came to life on the Super Famicom floppy disk drive, but gained notoriety after the ROM was dumped onto the internet, and it places the player in the role of Chin the Killer Machine, who's assigned the gargantuan task of wiping out 1.2 billion communists in a top-down shmup reminiscent of Space Invaders. The controls are not surprisingly very simple. Press Y to shoot and keep pressing it as if your life depended on it, because it pretty much does in the chaotic abyss that is Hong Kong 97. Enemies fill the screen at random intervals, providing a true test of our reflexes, and there are syringe-resembling invincibility items that offer a temporary reprieve from this madness, but the classic one-hit death system ensures that we'll rack up a never-ending amount of game overs and be constantly bombarded by the disturbing background image that accompanies them. There has been rampant speculation about the origins of this picture, with the most common theory being that this is a real dead body, but there's no definitive proof from the developer or any outside sources that this is the case. Legit corpse or not, it still sends a shiver down my spine at the mere thought of it, and adds tremendously to the mystique of this unreleased oddity. nightmare fuel aside, Hong Kong 97 shares a lot in common with the classic arcade cabinets that inspired it. The action seamlessly flows from one section to the next, and Chin encounters the same string of enemies over and over again until the big bad drops in. The head honcho is pretty easy to eliminate. Just move to the sides when it's about to drop and spam Y until it's vaporized, and the process will begin anew with a fresh wave of ugly reds to wipe out. As far as I can tell, Hong Kong 97 truly takes after its arcade influences, as it appears to lack any kind of ending. I was only able to complete about 5 or 6 rounds in the hour I spent playing it, but that was enough to reach the undeniable conclusion that Happysoft devised an experience like no other. The gameplay itself is fairly normal, and the presentation is as primitive as it gets, with reliance on low-res screenshots and a soundtrack comprised of one infinitely repeating 5 seconds long clip, but all of these layers add up to make it a creation of horrific beauty. Horrific is of course the key word in that sentence, and if I'm being completely honest with myself, there really aren't any redeemable traits within the genetic makeup that is Hong Kong 97, but in spite of all that, I somehow managed to enjoy my time spent with it. Shocking as it may seem, I became addicted in my attempts to reach the end, if that was even possible, and I had a big dopey grin on my face whenever I heard that monotonous melody. I technically can't defend this game, and I'm not gonna even try, but that doesn't mean I can't consider it to be a guilty pleasure, so it's on that note that I rule that the verdict is Ginnocent. The term "so bad it's good" gets tossed around pretty liberally these days, but it's an overused phrase that fits Hong Kong 97 to a T. The plot is ridiculous in the best way possible, the arcade action provides a fun challenge, and that disorienting earworm is super catchy. On top of all that, the developer recently came out and confessed that the whole thing was more or less made as a joke, so that, combined with the fact that it never saw the light of day from a commercial perspective, makes this one notorious title that's hard to hate, and I'd recommend checking out the ROM for the novelty factor alone. Anyway, now that I've wrapped up this supersized trial of epic proportions, I have some unfinished business to attend to. Dark Castle, the day has finally arrived for you to be punished for all of your grievous crimes against the gaming community. Burn in hell, you despicable SOB! Justice is served, and with that, it's time for the next IUPG adventure. Be sure to come back for that and leave any suggestions for future episodes in the comments below, but until then, court is now adjourned! Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, the boxes on the screen right now will lead to some more of my videos, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel by clicking on my avatar in the bottom right hand corner. Thanks again.